there is a reality of redemption where God takes a thing that is purely not good, and he transforms it into something rich. And it's not a sort of Christian romance novel, like put a bow on it. It's not the kind of thing where you reverse engineer it and go, well, see, then it was good. You go, no, it was bad. It was just bad. But God is just good.
Welcome to the Desperate for Hope podcast, Conversations on Divorce. I'm your host, Vaneetha Reisner, and today my guest is Barnabas Piper. Barnabas is a pastor and an author of several books, including Help My Unbelief, Why Doubt is Not the Enemy of Faith, which sounds very intriguing to me, and The Pastor's Kid. Barnabas has walked through divorce himself, which makes him such a great guest to talk about the struggles from the inside out of divorce. So I know this will be a huge gift to listeners. So welcome to the show, Barnabas. Thank you so much for being here.
That's an honor for you to ask. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, before we begin, I'd love for you to just tell our listeners where you live and what your day-to-day life looks like.
Yeah, so I live in the Nashville area and Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm married now to Lauren. We've been married for about 5.5 years. I have 2 older daughters from my first marriage, so a college sophomore and a high school junior. And then we have an 18-month-old son. So I'm living in multiple headspaces every day. You know, there's helping somebody be an adult and helping somebody not destroy our house. Kind of everything in between. But I'm one of the pastors on staff at Emmanuel Church, which is just on the west side of Nashville. And so that's kind of my vocation and the calling that the Lord's given me. And that's all part of a story of how God works in very surprising ways. I didn't anticipate being in ministry. But that's generally what life looks like is ministry at Emmanuel, which I love, and that church family, and then my family at home, which is this interesting blend of toddlers and teenagers and young adults. So it's a good life.
Yeah, never a dull moment, I'm sure, in your house. Well, Barnabas, for those who don't know your story, can you share a bit about your journey through separation and divorce? And you can start wherever you want.
Yeah. So I went to a Christian college outside Chicago. So grew up in a pastor's home. Lived in Minnesota till I was 18, went away to college outside Chicago. While I was there, through church, met my first wife. So she had gone to that church for several years. We didn't go to college together, but met her and got married just out of school. So I was young, 22 years old. And we had our first daughter very early in our marriage. And I would say for the first 5 years of our marriage, most of the challenges we faced were my responsibility, my fault, if you will. Spiritual immaturity, pride, a lot of spiritual, I'd say lack of identity. I just didn't have a peaceful confidence in who I was in the Lord. And so that meant that there was a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of struggle, a lot of pride, I just created a lot of conflict and difficulty, as well as ended up getting fired from a job 5 years into our marriage because of some of that hypocrisy and dishonesty. So there was I created a lot of difficulty and trust issues in the home there. Not marital infidelity kind of stuff, but just not being able to, she couldn't take me at my word for those first 5 years. And then through those difficulties, as the Lord so graciously does, he really brought me to a place of lowness and brokenness. And that was a real pivot point for me in terms of beginning to understand what does it mean to find identity in Christ, to receive the grace of Christ. I was a believer prior to that, but just hadn't had that sort of wake up experience to the reality of the goodness of Jesus. It was a lot of, I'd say, head knowledge without the sort of heart transformation piece. At the same time, my now ex-wife was experiencing kind of the opposite, where she was growing more and more distant and less confident in the Lord. And so the second half of our marriage, we were married about 11 and a half years in total. The second half of our marriage was kind of a departure of ways in terms of the Lord drawing me closer to Him and her moving another direction, and all the decisions that go with that. And so we got divorced in 2016. Right at the end of the year, I actually got the notice of finalization while I was driving with my daughters up to visit family for Christmas. And so it was, it was a real mixed bag of, here's Christmas, here's family, and here's kind of the declaration of death, if you will. And it was, as is the case in most divorces, it's never quick and it's never easy. There's always a lot that goes into it, the years worth of conflict and struggle and seeking help. And in our case, we'd also moved in 2013 from the Chicago area to Nashville. So relocating, struggling to find friendships and a church. So I was pretty isolated at that point. And then, so 2016, the divorce was finalized, and, in God's kindness, it was not an aggressively contentious thing. I know that's not everybody's story. There's a lot of really difficult, especially things like custody battles and stuff. And we were able to be amicable about that and share custody. And my ex has been a very, present, faithful mom to our girls. And so that's never been an issue. We were able to figure out how to co-parent, which is really hard. But again, there's been a lot of mercy there for us to not be at each other's throats about it. And I think thankfully both of us have been able to kind of maintain the mindset of this is for the kids. So the decisions that we make are not selfishly driven, if we're capable of that, and that alleviates a lot of the tensions and the rivalries that can arise. And so, I guess we've been divorced now almost 10 years, about 9 years now, and so a lot has happened since then. But that's sort of the general arc of how we got there. And man, it feels like yesterday, and it feels like a really long time ago all at the same time.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And I just so appreciate your candor of just owning what you did at the beginning, because I feel like a lot of people don't see that themselves. So thank you for that. Well, Barnabas, you are a pastor, so you were a strong believer when you were going through the divorce. How did that affect your view of God and faith? Because it sounds like you kind of recommitted, or kind of had a fire underneath you for 5 years, and then this happens.
Yeah, it was. So at the time I was working in publishing, I was in Christian publishing for about 14 years, including during the time going through the divorce, and so not in church ministry, but actively serving, the larger church and in ministry in that way. I would say it's one of those things that when I look back on those first several years of marriage, when I was keeping my distance from the Lord in sort of a heart submission kind of way, and then He ran me down, as God does. Had that not happened, I don't know what my experience of faith would have been like in going through divorce, in terms of bitterness, in terms of deconstruction, anger, falling into temptation, all sorts of things. But as it was, because of the work that the Lord had done in my life, my experience was that so many people who've been through suffering of various kinds have, which is that you never experience the presence of Christ more closely than when you were at the lowest point, and you never encounter the reality of Jesus sustaining you more than when you don't have anything else to sustain you. I just have such vivid memories, and I don't mean to sound over dramatic, of like moving into my own apartment, don't have it furnished yet. So, I mean, it's just like an empty, vacant, beige space with nobody there. And I've got, my possessions. So I've got my books, I've got my clothes, nowhere to put them yet. And I've got Christ, and that's it. And, I was adult enough to make a life and put things together, but that was kind of the posture of my soul. Is like, I don't really have a lot to go on. Everything I'd counted on my life looking like, it didn't anymore. But Christ was present and faithful. And all I can chalk it up to is just his persistent grace, because I wasn't in a healthy church situation at that time. I was part of a church, but I was not very well connected. I struggled to find a home there. And I didn't have a lot of deep friendships locally because I was still relatively new to town, and because I didn't have a deep church connection. So I didn't have this sort of rich community of people surrounding me. And yet I had the Bible, I had the Lord's promises. I did have close friends at a distance who were encouraging and praying and lifting me up in family. But that was it felt very much just Ray Ortlund wrote a book recently called, I think it's called God in the Low Places, or Meeting God in the Low Places. It felt that. It was just that at the absolute valley where the Lord showed up the most clearly for my soul, in just a sustaining, one day at a time, put one foot in front of the other. My grace is sufficient for you. My mercies are new every morning. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Today's troubles are sufficient for today. Just all those things that Scripture says, you go, oh, he meant it. It's all real. And I just encountered that day after day.
Wow, I love that. Well, you mentioned a bunch of scriptures, Barnabas. Were there any that you just kind of clung to in particular, or was it just the Bible?
There was a lot that popped up at different points. I think the one that, of course I've lost the reference in my mind now. I want to say it's in Psalm 36, but I might be wrong about that. It's the promise where he says he will turn your mourning into dancing. And just that picture of there is a reality of redemption where God takes a thing that is purely not good, and he transforms it into something rich. And it's not a sort of Christian romance novel, like put a bow on it. It's not the kind of thing where you reverse engineer it and go, well, see, then it was good. You go, no, it was bad. It was just bad. But God is just good. Mm-hmm. And somehow, in his mysterious wisdom, he turns the mourning into rejoicing and celebrating and dancing. And so that was a verse that it's a verse that is incredibly meaningful to me now, because it is something I can look back through and say, yeah, that my life is joyful now, not perfect, but I'm really happy in a way that I just could never have. In those days, I could not have ever pictured this. And that is of the Lord, his kindness. And so in those dark days, that verse was more like, he said it. I'll take his word for it. I cannot imagine what it looks like. And so that verse especially resonated because it's a whole narrative wrapped up in a couple phrases.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great. My husband, Joel, loves that verse as well. He's written it on things, and he's a widower. And so, lots of lost people can see how God, the dancing is really God, though. It's not, exactly what you said.
And it doesn't undo the past in an erasure sort of way. I think a lot of Christians who believe deeply in the sovereignty of God still have sort of a duality mindset where like this replaces that. And you're like, no, it's just, we have to get comfortable with this mysterious thing that God does, where you look back and you have to be able to say, that shouldn't have happened. I wish it hadn't happened. It was bad that it happened. And also, had it not happened, I would not have experienced any of this goodness of God. Mm-hmm. And so you don't call the bad thing good, but you do say undeniably good came out of it, because God does stuff that doesn't make any human sense.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, Barnabas, one of the things that was hard for me was people offering unsolicited feedback, strong reactions, telling me, friends and strangers, what they thought. So how did you navigate, in that situation after having been in publishing, kind of not knowing people that well, but also being sort of public, having written? How did you navigate the temptation between protecting your privacy, deciding who to share what with, and then wanting to defend yourself?
Yeah. And that is such a mixed bag because there's, especially when there are kids involved, there's defending yourself, but there's also, if you want your children to have a healthy relationship with your ex, you have to participate in not damaging that. And so in the sharing of anything, there has to be the conscious thought of, I cannot disparage the reputation of this person, even if they're, nobody knows who they are. They're not a public figure or whatever, but they're, if my kids ever heard me say something, they need to know that I'm speaking truthfully, but also not tearing down their mother, because that's that's divisive. It's costly. It's a mistake that I think a lot of divorced people make, giving into the temptation of sort of propping themselves up on the failings of their ex. And sometimes those failings are really pronounced. It's just not beneficial. So there's all of that factor thrown in. And so those are sort of the categories that I had in my mind. I think for early on, so maybe if just a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I wrote something that I put out just on my own personal website. And I think I just called it When a Marriage Dies. And it was a reflection on the end of a marriage in broad sweeping terms, speaking to my heartbreak, but trying not to throw anybody under the bus as much as it was just kind of an announcement, kind of a where my heart is in this. And the response to it was largely really warm, and then a few just really awful responses, because when you put things out on the internet, that's what people do. And when it comes to divorce, people, thankfully a small number, are very judgmental. They're just a hands down. I think there's also there's a perception, at least there was at that point, where if you are a man who's been divorced, you probably carry a particular burden of guilt. There are certain sins, that are associated with men. And I'm like, that actually wasn't the case for me, but there's the assumption. And so, yeah, then there's the temptation to defend myself. And what I had to realize very quickly was, the internet is not a place to do any defending. That's dumb. So if somebody had the guts to say something questionable to my face, which almost nobody does, most people keep their thoughts to, the keyboard. It's still a matter of, well, God knows. And I don't mean that in a self-righteous way. God knows my guilt, and God knows whatever justification needs to happen on my behalf. God knows the full story. He knows it better than I do. The people who know me well know, because they were aware for years of the decline, the struggle, and then have been the ones to walk with me through the life after the fact. And then about 6 months after the divorce is when I landed at Emmanuel just as an attender, and very quickly found a church home where I could be honest, and I could be received, and I could rest, and I could be restored. And so then encountering a church family where I could go to the leadership and say, hey, here's the full story. And then if there's something slanderous, something aggressive, something misunderstood, some unwanted piece of advice, I go, but I have pastors. I have elders, I have brothers, I have sisters in Christ. I have people who do know, who I can go to for counsel. And so I can kind of take a deep breath and shut some of that out and talk myself off the angry ledge. So it was a mix of those things. There's just the factors at play of who needs to be protected when I'm speaking. And I have to protect my kids. I don't really have to protect myself that much. That's the Lord's business. I really have to protect my kids, and in some sense protect the reputation of my ex at the level of, not dragging her through the mud for anything. And then I also can put my confidence in the Lord's justification and in the support and encouragement and understanding of those who actually know, and kind of leave the broader audience with, that's not, we were talking before we started, there's a lot where you just go, that's not your business. And maybe that's an internal statement. You just go, man, you don't need to know about that. And that's totally fair. Not everybody needs to know most things.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a little thing I had written on my bullet board, which was faith is trusting God to set the record straight. And I had to read that all the time because there is a temptation, especially because I was not I had not written a word then. And so it wasn't even public, but it was still, I knew it could get back to my kids.
Yeah.
And that was a big part of it, was I don't want to hurt them. So the same thing, because there's only a few trusted people you can really tell what's happened.
I do think that changes as kids get older, just from the perspective of, the appropriateness of what you can share with them and what you can encourage them to talk to their, your ex about. That has been helpful for me, just because there are things that, they get to an age, they start asking more pointed questions, and it becomes reasonable to say, that's a question you should ask your mom about, and she needs to be able to share on her terms. Or I can speak more freely than I did. But, trying to explain to an 8-year-old there's just a ton of blank space there and a very unsatisfying response, but also an 8-year-old doesn't have the emotional capacity to kind of navigate things. And so you protect your kids differently as you get older. You never throw them to the wolves, but there does become more and more we're all kind of working in the realm of greater clarity, transparency, honesty here, to a much greater degree, at least.
Yeah, that has been my experience. My kids were 10 and 13, and so there's only so much you're going to tell a 10 and 13-year-old.
Right.
But when they were in their early 20s, they wanted to know more, and I told them to talk to their dad, and I told them more things than I would have before because they could handle it. So I'm guessing for people who are listening that are like, what should I tell my kids? You really need to look also at their age, and then talk to your ex-spouse about them telling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's good. Thank you. Well, Barnabas, I know the ways I grieved, but I know that men grieve differently from women. So what did grief look like for you, like sort of moving through that season?
Yeah, I don't laugh because it's funny. I laugh because it's, I just look back and think it's a lot like watching a kid learn how to ride a bike or something. You're like, it's just tipping off one side or the other constantly, with a lot of bruises and scrapes along the way. And so grief for me was something I had to early on get help learning how to navigate, because it tended to kind of channel its way into other emotions. So for me, that trended towards either anger, and not rational anger, just sort of lashing out irrationally. Thankfully, not at my kids, but just sort of in life, just sort of a boiling undercurrent of anger. So it actually showed up more in work, frustration, irritability, sharp tongue at people who absolutely didn't deserve it. Or it channeled into more just sort of suppressed energy. So I'm going to suppress the feeling and just drive. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to be more productive. I'm going to be more involved in, fitness or whatever it was. And I pushed harder. And I mean, some of that is healthy. Some of that was productive. But I had to go to a counselor early on and just kind of think through and talk through what it looked like to face grief, and realize there's no way around it. You just go through it. And actually, one of the things that helped me profoundly was the realization that lament is a biblical thing. And the Bible, I had a very theological framework for so many things in Scripture, and then coming to it and going, this is a deeply human book. I mean, it's God's word, but it was written through the works of humans. And lament is something like 2/3 of the Psalms, where it's just a pouring out of something dark, sorrowful, betrayal. I mean, you can find every element of divorce is in there. Everything, whatever your experience has been, the Psalms address dishonesty, they address betrayal, loneliness, depression, abuse. All sorts of things are in there, and you go, oh, God has given me the resources to cry out and given me permission. And so one of the things that became dear to me was Psalms of Lament, because I just wasn't confident I knew how to do this well in prayer or in talking to others. And that gave not necessarily verbiage, but sort of a lane. There's a way to do this that honors the Lord, that is kind of ugly honest, not just sort of you're not prettying this up at all. So that was a big piece of it. And then I think just practically speaking, a man has to find what the outlets are. Very few guys are going to go cry with a group of friends. That's just kind of not, some guys will, which is totally fine. It's just not our norm. But even just the permission to yourself to go fall apart, put the kids to bed and fall apart. It happened often. Or sit alone and fall apart because the kids are not with you, which is a particular kind of sorrow. And those falling aparts are not a failure. They're not they don't say anything less. They don't diminish you as a man. In fact, they're probably encountering an aspect of your humanity that you're just unaccustomed to. And I've never experienced, I've heard a lot of, you see it in literature, you hear women say, like, there's nothing like a good cry. I'm like, I've never experienced that in my life. Every cry ever has been awful. But there is a healthfulness to it. It's, it's like getting a dislocated joint put back in place. It hurts, it's awful, but it's relieving and you're better for it. So there's just an honesty in it. So I would say all of that was an aspect of navigating the grief. I definitely needed help from a therapist, a Christian therapist, just helping me think through how do you be an honest man? How do you navigate this? And just sort of coming to terms with, like, this is actually wildly overwhelming. You should be overwhelmed right now. If you're not, you're lying to yourself. And then the channels for it, the means for it, and the biblical category of lament was so freeing for me to learn how to grieve in hope. Not sunshiny hope, just I have something to hold on to while I feel like I'm drowning.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. Did you you mentioned, you wouldn't go cry with a group of friends, which I totally get. But did you have friends that you could, like, even long distance, kind of cry with, or is that not a guy thing? I
don't know that it's super common for guys. I think grief can get to a place of being so overwhelming, it just happens. And there were 2 or 3 friends, mostly guys who I had known from living in Illinois at that point. So we lived in different states, but I could get on the phone with them. There was one point where 2 or 3 friends just came down and just said, we're just spending the weekend with you just because. And there wasn't a lot of crying that happened there. They were more like, we're going to take your mind off this. We're just going to have fun, which is also really helpful because you need some brightness in your life when life just feels dark all the time. And they're like the funniest guys I know, so it was really helpful in that way. But yeah, I remember conversations, and again, once I got into a church family where I realized, oh, these are the real ones. Like I can be myself. There was a lot more of that pouring out of the heart with pastors or with individual brothers. But I'd say it was a slow developing thing. I would say, I'm 42 now and a lot more comfortable with tears now than I was at 36. Just the realization of the sheer darkness and heaviness of so many aspects of life and the weight of pain. And so, maybe not crying about the same things, but it's just a thing where you go, yeah, it's actually, it's good, it's right, it's human. If Jesus can weep over the things that he intends to fix. He's about to resolve this, and he still feels that way. Me and my helplessness is entirely appropriate.
Yeah, thank you. Well, kind of with grief, what temptations did you face in that season that maybe were surprising that you hadn't felt tempted by before?
I mentioned a couple earlier, just sort of the mishandling of emotions, leaning towards anger, and then what I would call almost idolatry, kind of putting my hope in being a scheduled, rigid person. I'm gonna maximize my minutes. And I've never been one of those sort of wake up at 4:30 a.m. and do the cold soak, and like the guys that you see on Instagram who just like that. You wake up at 4:30, you're in bed by 9, and you eat all this protein. I'm like, no, not all that. I just mean pouring myself into what the Lord had put in front of me. And again, there's some goodness in that, but like it trended workaholism. So that was one thing. And I would put that in sort of kind of an idol of distraction. But the flip side of that was, the flip side of productivity was the temptation just towards numbing in general. And there are so many versions of that. And I dabbled in all of them that I was aware of, not like illicit drugs, but like alcohol. Sometimes things hurt so bad, you just want it to quit. And I found that wildly unsatisfactory, but I know for some people it's an aggressive temptation. But I understood the temptation for the first time. I had never been tempted toward substance dependence. But all of a sudden, you look at a liquor cabinet and you go, I get it. That cabinet would provide hours of oblivion, which sounds decent right now, given how much this hurts. So that was a thing that I wouldn't put it in the category of like, I had to fight against it. It was more just like, oh, I get it now. I get why that's a draw. I think another one is, and this, just to be real blunt, there's just like you've been faithful in marriage for these years, and then you get out of marriage and you're like, what does dating look like? I hadn't dated seriously since I was 22, and between 2005 and 2016, like the internet was invented and all of the apps. And so just the temptations that come with being available were all of a sudden like, oh, I have to navigate that. And again, by God's kindness, it wasn't something that was like an overwhelming thing. But I mean, I talked to 2 or 3 friends over the course of the last several years who went through divorce, and they were like, yeah, you find out how easy it is to just be sexually active, to be out there, to make yourself available, especially as a guy. I mean, there's a particular ease to it if you are a guy who somewhat has your life together and can treat people decently. And I hope this isn't overly transparent, but like it is a temptation that men who are quote unquote back on the market face. And that is one that, thankfully I looked at it and it was more like see it and back away quickly, because you're like, that is going to ruin some stuff. But it's there. I think my greatest temptation that I really struggled with was the temptation towards isolation. I did have these sweet experiences of my Christ sustaining reality, but it was a massive hurdle for me to get over, to trust in God's people, to just walk back into church. I didn't quit going, but I was definitely like a back row, slip out early. Like that was my comfort level. I just didn't have entrusting myself to new people, entrusting myself to those who I needed to speak into my life was just hard. Isolation was easier. And it was miserable. And so I think that was probably my greatest temptation. And I could make so many excuses for, I've got the kids, so trying church is awkward, or whatever. There's 1,000 reasons to not invest deeply in meaningful community and relationships. So I think that was probably the one. Numbing, entertainment numbing, work numbing, and then isolation were the ones that were particularly an uphill battle for me.
Thank you so much for the way you just kind of outlined your struggles as well as other people's, because I am sure there are people listening that are, men and women that are dealing with all of those things. So yeah, thank you. So from, kind of feeling, drawn to some of these temptations, going to a new church, feeling like you finally found a place where you could belong and, confide in people. So that seems like one of the pillars for you for sort of going from sort of despondency to rebuilding your life. But what else was there? Or how did you get involved in the church, actually, would be my bigger question is.
The short answer is it was sort of a cynical jump into the deep end, in that I'd been at one church for our first few years in Tennessee, large church, really struggled to find meaningful relationships and connection. And then post-divorce, I very quickly left that church just because I'd started going there because it was sort of a compromised church that at the time my ex was like, fine, we can do this one. And then she withdrew and I was like, why am I still here? I don't love this place. Most of these people don't even know me. And then, so I bounced around, tried a few different churches. and was just kind of growing over the course of several months, growing in like you think you used the word despondency. That's kind of how I felt towards the church, just sort of a general sense of, on the one hand, I know this is God's idea. I'm very confident that it is God's will for his people to be involved in church. And on the other hand, I have very low confidence that the church could be a place where you could be safe and honest and at home. So this felt like just a massive kind of idealistic gap. And it was a friend from out of state. It was a pastor friend in Texas. We were having lunch at a conference in Kansas City, and he was like, "You should visit Emmanuel." And I was like, "I don't want to visit Emmanuel." And he was not very gentle in his correction of me, appropriately so, because I was stubborn and wouldn't listen otherwise. He was, go, is where he ended up. And so within a few weeks, I ended up visiting Emmanuel. And I was, it wasn't like a love at first sight kind of thing. I didn't walk in and immediately go, "Oh, wow." I walked in and I thought, this seems like a healthy place, but my cynicism level and I'd been in the church my whole life. I felt I had sort of an arrogance of like, I can read a church. You go in, you kind of get the sense of it pretty quickly. I had some of that sort of judgmental arrogance about me. But I realized, they very publicly, Emmanuel will state this is a church that offers the welcome for those who are weary and hurting. And I was like, well, I'll put them to the test. That's what I mean by a cynical jump into the deep end. I was like, well, here we go. Because worst case scenario, I just leave. No harm done. Best case scenario, maybe they're telling the truth. Can't really imagine that, but I'll give it a shot. And so pretty quickly, I got involved in there was a men's gathering each week, which one of the key elements of was a time of gathering together into small groups and being honest. We call it walking in the light, that 1 John 1:7, if you walk in the light as he is in the light, you will have fellowship with one another, and cleansing by the blood of the Son. And so they just practiced that weekly, unburdening your heart. And so it could be a confession of sin or a confession of need and just putting it before the Lord and being prayed over. And so week one, I paired off with this guy named Dave, who is a few years older than me. He was wearing a Rush t-shirt, and I was like, all right, here goes. And I just laid out where my heart was at, and he just nodded and went, wow. All right, let's pray. And there was no sort of pearl clutching. There was no gossipiness. There was no nothing. And then after we were done, he just began to talk to me like a friend or like an aspiring friend. It was great to meet you. How did you get here? All these different kinds of things. And it was that. And then a small group where a similar kind of environment where I was the only single parent in the group, but my kids were folded in and loved quickly and made fast friends with these people. And they just absorbed my story. And so between those things and then the substance of the ministry itself in terms of teaching and everything, I go, oh, like there's not a disparity between what is proclaimed from the pulpit and what is lived by the people of God in terms of a reflection and a reliance on the grace of Jesus. And so I went in cynical, and within a matter of months, I realized I'm in. I believe it. These people are the ones that God has put in my life to encourage, to restore, as I hit these various low points, some really low points in trying to navigate these things, and then some high points and some dashed hopes and different things. These were the friends who I leaned on. These were the pastors who led me. And so I'd say for about a year, it was a lot of that, just restoration of soul. And then about a year in, I started to get more involved in participation at more of a leadership level and invited into a little bit of teaching here, a little bit of small group facilitation there, some planning things. And then in the surprising, very surprising turn, but a year and a half into being at Emmanuel, I started to get the sense that the Lord was doing something, kind of pulling me out of my vocation. And apparently the leadership of the church saw something, because they came to me and said, we think you should consider pastoral ministry. And I thought they were nuts, but I think it was of the Lord. So here I am.
Wow. I love that story, Barnabas, because I think there's a lot of people that do leave a church for whatever reason, after divorce, whether their ex-spouse is still there or they just a myriad of reasons. And I think people are hesitant to step back in because they're like, I'm not going to find one. People don't know me. And so that is such a practical, and beautiful example of we walk in with skepticism,
Yeah.
especially I feel like divorce felt like the big scarlet A. Like, and
Yes.
I was at the same church, but I know a lot of people say, like, I don't even want to tell anybody this. Like, I don't know what they're going to think. And so people end up watching it online. And I love how God really rebuilt you through the church, even though you weren't going like, I can't wait to find a church.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely could have waited to find a church. I was eager to wait. But I think you use the term scarlet letter. That resonates so much with how I felt, especially visiting different churches. Just that idea of like when somebody just sort of, people just innocently pose questions, oh, you got kids? Where's your wife? And you're like, now I have to say like there's the big scarlet D on my chest,
Mhm.
just divorce, that thing. And you have to kind of share the story. Then you get into some of that, like how much do I say and not say? How much is their business? How much do you make excuses? And I just learned to say very little, just to say, just recently went through a divorce trying to find a new church. And you just kind of leave it at that. And what I found was, I needed to learn to be gracious with people because most people do not know how to navigate that. They they don't they don't want to ask any questions for fear of stepping on a landmine. But that then leaves them kind of going, oh, okay, well, glad you're here. And so then you feel like, nobody's interested. Nobody knows me at all. Nobody wants to. And so I needed to learn to be gracious with people and realize like when you say you've been through a divorce, especially recently, they don't know what to say. Nobody's gotten training on how to respond well to a divorced person or to turn the conversation more just towards their life now, you know, or, just sort of people just freeze. And so that was one thing because that lent to cynicism. I got the impression that I was on the outs at places. But there are also churches that accidentally or otherwise make divorced people feel less welcome. The way marriage and divorce is talked about from the front, the way that there's just sort of a posture of coldness. And what I would say to anybody who's navigating divorce or been through, who's searching for churches, like if that's your experience while you're looking, just move along.
Mm.
You don't, there are other churches where you will be embraced with not with any sort of papering over the ugly, but just you being embraced. You as a son or daughter of God. You as a new friend. You as somebody who needs to rest and receive. And that's what I found at Emmanuel. And there are a lot of other churches that provide similar sorts of care, I think. But just the place where people just look at you and go, "We're glad you're here. Let us know if you need anything." You can just receive. You don't need to bring anything to the table. And then to see your kids cared for, if you have kids, is a particular kind of invitation as well. That was one of the things about Emmanuel that drew me in was my kids were kind of the litmus test for churches. We leave a place and they'd be like, "I hate it." And I'd be like, "Well, we're probably not going back there then because I'm not fighting that battle every Sunday." And we left Emmanuel and I was like, "How was it?" And they were like, "It was good." And then within a couple weeks, like they were kind of running ahead of me in. And I was like, "Oh, this is their spidey senses have sensed something good here, that they're ahead of me on this one." So the kids were a meaningful kind of litmus test of love, I would say, in terms of what is in the culture of the church.
Mm. There's so many things you said that I loved. One was just know what you're going to say when you walk in. Like, I think that is a freeze point, and then you end up over explaining. So I love that you were like recently divorced, looking for a church. Like, you don't have to give them a ton of information, but sometimes we spill out more and then we don't know what to do. So
Yeah, you just kind of trip over your own words until you're like, "Man, Dan, I just ruined this conversation."
exactly. Let me just turn to the next person. And I also love that you went to leadership right away because that's a good way to know how is the church really going to respond. Because you might be sitting beside somebody who's just been there 3 weeks. It is completely judgment, and you don't know who you're sitting beside, but you go talk to the leadership and you know what the church is about. So
Yeah, and I would say at a healthy church, you can't catch leadership off guard. If you come in with a really painful story, a healthy church is they're gonna be sympathetic. They're gonna be gentle because of their understanding of the gospel. They're gonna have heard it before. Being on this side of the church leadership aisle now, there's just nothing that we haven't heard in terms of the painful things people have experienced, which doesn't make us numb to it, but it does at least give us some equipment to say, okay, we're glad you're here. Like that is not too much for Christ, and it's certainly not too much for Christ's people to love, to walk with, to navigate. What kind of help can we offer? And I found that at Emmanuel. I know there are other churches, lots of other churches that have the same gentle, welcoming posture. But yeah, going to leadership and just using that as you can get the temperature of the care, the love, the gentleness. You can tell pretty quick.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Well, you talked about your daughters, really being embraced by the church. How did you as a dad care for your daughters emotionally during that time? And how was your relationship? How did it change through the divorce, after the divorce?
Yeah. So my daughters were, I want to say 7 and 10 when we got divorced, real close to that. So young, but not so young as to not know what was going on. And I didn't really know how to emotionally support them. In terms of, I will say this, most dads don't know how to emotionally support most daughters, because daughters are a particularly delightfully complex set of little humans. And every daughter is different, so if you have multiple daughters, like there's a massive array of personality and gifts and emotional responses, and they each need different things. And so I was figuring all of this out just as a dad, and then there's a dad with this particular context. The things that I figured out quickly were, I knew that was a learning curve, so I was like, well, I'll just try to stay on the curve. I wanted, when they were with me, I wanted it to feel like home, not like summer camp. There's the temptation to be like, pack every minute with fun when they're with you. And I understand, like, if you have limited visitation or something like that, the context is different. I had 50-50 custody, which means they're doing homework and we're having dinner, and that means I'm going to provide real dinner and not junk food dinner. And try to have a rhythm that when they come in, they can, within a matter of an hour, can kind of transition into dad's home and go, okay, we're in the routine. Mm-hmm. And I understand that that's not emotional care at the deep level, but unsettledness is so hard for kids. I mean, it's hard for adults. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're recording this in a holiday season and nothing is a routine. And I think most adults feel just a little bit frazzled because it's not the normal kind of structure of life. You magnify that for little kids who are dependent. So that was one thing, is just, how do I structure something that they can take a deep breath and be comfortable in? I think the other thing was, I tried to be very honest with them about, to the degree that was age appropriate, about just my own state of things. Hey, dad's having a hard day, so I'm really sorry for my impatience. You don't deserve that. Would you forgive me? So trying to be ready to apologize, to make things right. I think one of the hardest challenges was realizing that when there are two parents in the home and one parent has had to be the disciplinarian in a moment, the other parent can kind of be the gentle one. And then sometimes you reverse roles. Ideally, you reverse roles. There's not always a mean one and a nice one. When you're flying solo, you are both. Mm-hmm. You have to discipline. Sorry, that's unacceptable. You can't speak that way, whatever. You can't hit your sister. But then you also have to turn around and be the comforter who resets the environment of the home. Because if it's harsh, then all of a sudden there's just sort of a cloud, like everybody's tense. How do you undo the tension? Well, you have to be able to kind of, in your own mind, go, I have to move from being tense, being angry, being disciplinarian, to take a deep breath, 5 minutes. Okay, how's everybody doing? Let's reset. And so you feel almost split personality in that way, which is really hard, but your kids need it, because you can't just let the tension be the dictator, nor can you just like sort of swing back and forth like you're psychotic. And so even if you feel it. So those are some significant things. I think the other thing, and I tried hard to gauge this, was to what degree do they need outside help? Mm-hmm. And, did they need counseling? Did they need, what sort of community did they need to be in? Honestly, being in a church a few months into this was so beneficial for them because they found an environment of friendships and people who they weren't sort of an isolated little just pod of kids. But I think those are probably the big ones. And then I've tried to be honest with my kids just on an ongoing basis of like, these are things I don't know. I'm not good at this. You're they're young women now, so I can just look at them and be like, you're a young woman. Like I'm learning. This is the first time I've ever done this. Everything you do for the first time, I also do for the first time. So those kinds of things. And that allows them a certain amount of sort of, they can be gracious with me. I'm amazed by how gracious my kids are with me. We certainly, we'll get cross with each other and argue and whatever else, but like the comeback around to forgiveness, to humor, to joy it's not hard. I don't think we have a home that's just sort of marked by tension. And that was one of the things I was dead set on early on, was like, I want a home that's peaceful. Not fake serene, but like, we're going to undo the bad that happened. So if there's been a big fight, blow up, we're going to undo that. If that's apologies, we're going to sit here and talk through it until we resolve this, so that life is shaped by peace with one another at the heart level. And to the degree that I was able, I think the Lord was kind in that, and I think that's been the case for us.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I'm sure for kids who are going between two homes, to feel like there's a place of peace versus chaos is so important. Well, kind of as we wrap up, I would love to just talk about the whole idea of dating, remarriage, how you met your wife, what made you think about dating, remarrying, and there's people in your life that have a different view of remarriage. And so we'll just love for you to share anything about that.
Yeah, you just brought up, people in my life who have a different view. That was one thing that I had to just kind of think through at a biblical level pretty intentionally, what is right in the eyes of the Lord. There are different biblical interpretations. We don't need to sort through them all right now. But with the guidance of some other helpful pastors, and there's a lot of books out there that have multiple views and whatever. I will say this: I found John Murray's book called Divorce to be the most helpful. It's also super dense, but in terms of just a thorough biblical understanding, it was really helpful in getting to a place of, there are circumstances where dating and remarriage maybe isn't right, and there are circumstances where you're free to do it. I found myself in that. The harder thing for me, so that felt familiar to me, was pursuing biblical answers like, okay, I know how to do this. Emotionally being prepared to be healthy in a relationship was much more nebulous. I didn't know how to do that well. And I made some mistakes early on. You kind of got back into dating too quickly and just didn't know how to handle that relationship well. Ended up hurting a woman who the relationship was not in we were not in a healthy place. There was nothing wrong with her. I just was not bringing to the table what was necessary. And I had to end it. And that kind of was the real uncomfortable wake up for me of like, oh, there's a lot of work to be done emotionally, relationally, in I don't want to say in community, but with input. The right sort of counselor input, the right sort of friend input, the friends who will tell you the right things, who will be bluntly honest with you and not just tell you what you want to hear. And so that was pretty quick after the divorce that I kind of foolishly got involved in that relationship too seriously. And then it was probably another year plus before I ever re-entered, which is actually what a counselor told me early on. I was going to this counselor and I was like, is there sort of a time frame for health? He's like, well, it's not on a calendar. He's like, but generally my advice would be you probably need a year plus, just that much time. And what I realized was a year allows you to experience everything once. Every first anniversary, first Christmas, first whatever without, and learn how to navigate grief, unhealth, and then kind of chart your own course. And so that was really helpful. And then the thing that the things that ended up moving me towards it were, I had a desire to be in a healthy relationship. I had pastoral input from one of our pastors who I trusted so much, and he just said, "You need to feel free to do this. Like in God's eyes, you're free. You can give yourself permission." And he's sort of a father figure, so it was really significant to hear that. But then I just realized, anytime I step into this, so it just a first date, am I leaving this person better off for having met me? Not that I'm like magic, but like just with kindness, respect, curiosity about them. If we decide this is not going anywhere, are they benefited by this, or am I a detriment? Because that to me at least gave categories for not being selfish, not defining things by my baggage, and if I'm incapable of this, then I'm not in a healthy place to date. So those are sort of the categories. And then I met my wife. It was actually a blind setup due to her sister. So her sister was attending our church at the time and saw me from a distance. We did not know each other. And she elbowed her boyfriend, who she's now married to, and was like, "Hey, Lauren needs to meet that guy." And she basically, a couple months later, just cornered me on a Sunday morning and said, "You need to meet my sister." And I tried to play it off, and I was like, "Why?" And she gave me 10 good reasons why I should meet Lauren. And I was like, "Yeah, but I don't know you or her that well." "It's just coffee." And I was like, "That's actually a really compelling argument. Like worst case scenario, it's $10 in an hour." And so we went out a week later, and it wasn't just coffee. We pretty quickly figured out that this was going somewhere. And she was through a lot of that thought process. I had come to sort of these, like, I didn't have like a checklist I was looking for, but just these categories of what kind of a person is this. And she had really deep friendships with people who weren't me. She didn't need me in her life. She lived a rich life without me, which was really significant. She was deeply involved in her church and had been for years, her church family. So like just the level of devotion to spiritual community, spiritual life. She had a hunger for growing in the Lord. She was humble enough to be like, "I'm not where I want to be, but here's my desire, my participation." And then there's just all the personality things, do we click? Do we like each other? Those kinds of things. So I mean, but having those categories are like, these are the substantial things that, like, I know the person needs to prioritize these things, because otherwise this is going to be unhealthy. And so am I healthy coming in? And what's the health level of that person in terms of just participation in meaningful relationships, and especially relationship with the Lord and the church? And she had it, and she's awesome.
Oh, great. Oh, love that story. A lot of wisdom in there for people, but which I would love to unpack, but want to just ask you right now, if you could speak directly to the listener who's going through divorce and really feels sort of devastated, disconnected, ashamed, and listening, looking for hope, what would you say to them, Barnabas?
I think the word that you use that stands out to me most in that question is ashamed, because that shame is just never of the Lord. Guilt might be. A lot of us have participated in the ruination of our marriage to a degree that we should feel guilty. But guilt can be dealt with, and actually has been dealt with, if we will receive it at the cross. Shame is a lie from the devil that demeans us below how God views us. And I think that's the thing that I would want somebody who is wrestling. Like, you are going to feel devastated, because it's like, heartbreaking is too gentle of a word for what it feels like to have navigated divorce. It is an utterly crushing reality. Even if it looks on the outside like everything was fine and they kind of parted ways peacefully, your life is now not at all what you anticipated. It is in tatters. Shame, though, is a thing by which we try to define ourselves, or the devil tries to define us. And I would want somebody to be able to differentiate between, I need to hand my sins over to the Lord, whatever those were, and receive forgiveness, but then recognize that the way my Heavenly Father looks at me is never, ever marked by shame. He does not look at you as less than, as anything other than a beloved child, if your faith is in Him. So Shame is the thing that I think ruins people's path forward so often, because shame turns us into those who we can't come before God because of it. We can't be restored because of it. We're holding ourselves back because we're allowing shame to be defining us, as opposed to recognizing how our Heavenly Father views us, even if we have been divorced. So I think that's the thing that I would want particularly for people to hear and to feel is you still are under the smile of God. Your circumstances are miserable. You as a person are not less than in the eyes of your Heavenly Father.
I love that, smile of God. Well, Barnabas, where can people find out more about you, your ministry, your writing?
Yeah, I have a website. It's just barnabaspiper.com. So that's sort of a kind of a catch-all for things that I write. And then I'm on Threads, I'm on Instagram, so people can hit up social media and find me there. Those are probably the two easiest ways to kind of keep track. And then I serve at Emmanuel Church. So if people are ever coming through Nashville or live in town, it's just emmanuelnashville.com, and would be thrilled to connect with folks as they pass through as well.
Oh, great. Well, I'll have to, when I'm in Nashville, I'll have to stop by.
Please do.
And then just last question, something I like to ask every guest is, what is something fun that you love so much you could practically do an ad for it?
Oh, man. I enjoy so many different things. I think, all right, I'm going to get super nerdy and niche in Nashville. There's a place in Nashville called the Station Inn, which is it opened in the 1960s. It's a music venue that I don't think they've cleaned the floor since the 1960s. So you walk in and it is all that stickiness of beer and soft drinks and whatever. And they do largely sort of Americana, folk, bluegrass, whatever music. But every Sunday night, they do something called the Bluegrass Jam, which is where any bluegrass musician who wants to can pop in and play as part of this group. And it's free. You buy food and drink. Their food is bad bar food, and they have like 5 beers on tap and soft drinks, and that's it. And it is so fun. You feel like you're going back in time. It's super casual. If you're in Nashville, there's a lot of posturing. There's a ton of bachelorette parties, and everything is done for Instagram. Station Inn is the least Instagrammable place ever, which is part of the reason it's awesome. So just picking the most niche Nashville thing, I'm going to go with the Bluegrass Jam at Station Inn on Sunday nights. If you're ever in town, it is an absolute blast. Even if you don't like bluegrass, it's just fun and a super cool environment.
Oh, wow. Well, I feel like you just did an ad for it. That's pretty great, Barnabas.
I could, yeah. I don't know. They don't sponsor me, but I wouldn't be mad if they did.
Maybe they should, Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Barnabas. I loved our conversation, and there's so many things I took away, but I think the church and the importance of that, even if you feel skeptical, find a church and plant your roots deep. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me. But I feel certain what we talked about today is going to encourage people. So if today's episode encouraged you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. I'll see you next time. Thanks. Thanks for listening. This podcast goes along with my book, This Was Never the Plan: Walking with God Through the Heartache of Divorce, available everywhere books are sold. If this episode was helpful, you can follow the podcast wherever you listen. Links and resources mentioned are in the show notes. See you next time.